the advisory committee and planning committee. Committee would be an informal advisory group to the county commission. Discussion and decision. Before we get started, I asked for a gentleman to come in and give a little bit of a talk on this sapphire. His name is Peter Cole. He's out of the university. You can introduce yourself. But I want you to know that we have to advertise for this board, so it will get put in the paper. But I put stuff out, and then if we put it in the paper, then whoever wants to get on it, and I'm thinking it's going to be between 5 people and 7 people. So I'm not going to get into a whole big pile, and we'll never get nothing accomplished. Other than that, I've been going over a lot of support for and oppose, and there's lots. I get lots of calls, and Elena brought to our attention that we should advertise for this board, which I thank you for that. So, Peter, if you want to come up here and give a little say about the old wilderness,
Well, a bit out of my normal forte. I'm Peter Kolb. I'm the Montana State Extension Forestry Specialist. And my primary role is to work with private landowners and loggers and foresters all across Montana. So I cover everything from windbreaks to shelter belts to forest health and a lot of fire recovery, fire hazard reduction, things like that. I don't usually get involved on federal lands, though federal lands impact private lands just because they're the majority of the land base. And there's spillover, particularly from wildfires and things like that start on federal lands and then get going. And these days, most firefighting is done by backing away, finding a place where there has been some fuel reduction work, and doing burnouts, creating a black line around that big fire. And so this last year was a real pivotal year because we had a lot of fires, but particularly we had a lot of fires that started on federal land and burned down on private land, or where private land was used to try and contain the fires. Lolo Peak, Sunrise Mountain fires are two that I'm very much involved with, where there was a lot of burnout on private land, and it's a little bit of a double whammy for the private landowners because they've expended all the money and effort to do fuel hazard reduction on their place, and then you have a big project fire going on. Incident command team comes in and they look at where the fuel reduction's been done to do their burnouts, and that's on private land. And so they get hit twice, and sometimes there's damages and there's no compensation for those landowners. Now, what does that have to do with wilderness area? Well, wilderness areas are usually places where there's no roads, where there's a sense that things haven't changed a lot over time. And so the Sapphire Wilderness proposed study area, I don't know how long that's been in place, but we've had a lot of wilderness study areas. These are areas where they're under investigation to see if they would qualify for a wilderness area. And typically there's no roads on them, and they have original pristine, what we consider pristine conditions on them. And so there's a variety of advocacy groups that have pushed for these all over the state. And the Sapphire is pretty typical of areas that they look for, away from roads. Sometimes they have commercial timber on them, sometimes they don't, but mainly away from roads and with some primary water features on them. And so, you know, when I look at this one, you have a map of it right here. You know, it really encompasses the Chain of Lakes areas and the Pintlers, where it seems like it would be a reasonable place if you're going to do wilderness because there are no roads, access is difficult. The timber value is not terribly great on there, and so it just has mainly high recreational value and recreational use. Now, they kind of followed it on the divide between Bitterroot and the Deer Lodge, as you know. Again, looking for areas where there are no roads, or what roads are there have not been used for a long, long time, and so they don't really mark them as roads. And you know, the definition of wilderness is untrammeled by man. Montana hosts, along with Idaho, the largest wilderness areas in the lower 48, just because we've got a lot of areas where it was darn hard to make a living in, and it's hard to get to. And so there's areas that have been relatively left alone. Now you can go in any of these areas and you know, there was past human use, you know, mining claims in a lot of places. Part of the Bob and the Scapegoat was actually ranched down the valley bottoms for a while. So, you know, this area fits what groups that want wilderness would consider as a primary location for that. And, you know, the main implications of designated as wilderness is you cannot use, once it's designated as that, you cannot use any kind of motorized types of vehicles in there. You can't even use mountain bikes in there, though there are people proposing changes to that. But I brought up the fire issue is because if an area is designated as a wilderness area, it's supposed to function naturally without human interference, which means if a fire starts in there, there's going to be a let burn policy until that fire starts to threaten human infrastructure, threaten to move out of the wilderness area. And of course, once you get a project fire, as you saw this summer, the mayor fire, etc., once those get on a roll, the only way you can contain them is with burnouts, where you're back burning up against it. And this is why I brought up the private land issue, because you can only do burnouts where you can have a certain amount of certainty that that fire is going to go the direction you want it to go, which means you can stop it where you're starting it from. And this is where fuel reduction work has been done. So, you know, there's always a variety of concerns with regard to any wilderness area because private use, such as leased grazing, things like that, become off limits. It's simply hunting, hiking, minimal impact from humans' activity on there. So it's kind of taken out of the economic base of an area.
So are you sure about the livestock grazing?
Pretty sure, yeah.
It's not true, yeah.
Well,
Let
if
him
there,
finish first.
Oh, okay.
I asked him here to give us
okay.
a talk, then Susie's done, then we can take some questions, but let him finish first.
Okay.
Got
yeah.
it?
I mean, every wilderness area is unique, and there might be some negotiating going on. I'm just speaking in a generality. I don't have specific inside knowledge about the Sapphire area, other than where it fits in the forest ecology side of things. It's largely lodgepole pine and spruce and subalpine fir as forest cover types in there. Of course, the lodgepole pine has been hit very, very hard by mountain pine beetle, where mountain pine beetle has impacted about 5.5 million acres in Montana, where it's typically killed 70 to 90% of the lodgepole pine, where mature lodgepole pine where it's hit. We're seeing some massive fuel loading as a result of that. Subalpine fir, spruce forests are fairly steady state. They suffer from a few insect disease issues. From a fire perspective, though, they support standard placing fires. So within the Sapphire, proposed Sapphire wilderness area, you have a lot of areas that are devoid of trees, a lot of rock, a lot of high elevation areas. Where you do have forest, it's a standard placing fire forest type. So just like the Mayor fire or Mayor Mountain fire, once that fire gets rolling in there, it's gonna go whichever way the wind is blowing, whichever the way the fuel takes it, until it hits an area where the fuel's been reduced. You know, it's very hard to fight those kind of fires. You can just try and contain them, like I mentioned, with burnout areas. I'm somewhat familiar with it because I'm an avid backpacker and hiker and hunter and all of that. There is a four-wheel track that cuts across it. I think it's the only track, I don't know if it's still functional or not, that goes from Copper Creek all the way over to Ravalli County. And so you guys might know more about it than I do. It's always been my desire to go to travel that, but I've never gotten around to it. So, but again, looking at it, you know, there are no direct roads. There are concerns that I've read about of some wild trails being established by hunters and other people that want to get into places. So, but usually the biggest concerns about wilderness areas is where there's a pre-existing use, someone's used to using it a certain way, and suddenly they cannot. The other part I mentioned the bark beetles and all of that, and fires. A large percentage of the bob and spotted bear, scapegoat wilderness areas have burned in the meantime. Those used to be about 90% forested. They're now about 30% forested because most of that has burned. And there's issues with clearing trail because you can't use a chainsaw in those areas. You got to use a crosscut saw. And the old name for a crosscut saw, of course, is the misery whip, and there's a reason for that. So there's all sorts of concerns and issues for maintenance of these areas, maintaining access to these areas with trails, etc. There are, of course, other concerns that roads will be built into them, logging will occur, mining will occur, like on other public lands, though the Forest Service has been very reluctant to build any new roads anywhere. And so as a wilderness study area, it's been de facto wilderness for at least a decade or so at this point in time. So I personally have no stake or opinions about it, whether it's good or bad. As a backcountry backpacker, I like that area, and it's nice to get away from people. But for other people, they might have other uses for it. But I would estimate it's about 60% timbered, 40% rocky, scree, open country that doesn't really support trees. So, you know, that's about as much as I can tell you about that. More if you have questions specifically about forest or fire ecology, I'm glad to provide any kind of insight that I might be able to for it. So,
if he's willing to answer some of your questions, but we're not going to get into a big long thing like the other day.
That was so fun.
Huh?
That was so fun, though.
Depends on how people think.
I'm sorry, I came in late. What is your name?
I'm Peter Kolb. I'm the Montana State Extension Forestry Specialist. So, I'm a forest ecologist, forest manager by background. So,
I invited him. I would have had it on here, but I got late. I know.
So
I asked him to come give a little speech on it, and I've known him a long time. He's gave lots of speeches for MLA.
So I did bring, you know, a few current background sheets. You might have seen the study that came out from Norman Nickerson's Institute of Tourism and Recreation Research, the Montana 217 Costly Fire Season, where Norma's office has people out there surveying tourists all summer long, gas stations and places. And so they talked to over 4,000 travelers, and they mailed out a bunch of stuff. And they did an analysis of the 2017 fire season on tourism. Tourism is the biggest, arguably the biggest money maker for Montana now, bringing in an annual revenue of $3.5 billion to Montana. And she surveys people, why do you come to Montana? These are out-of-state dollars that come into here. Why do you come here? About 50% of the population is here, and their main form of recreation is driving around window sightseeing. About another 25% do day hikes. Okay, so this is, and so Glacier, Yellowstone, places where they can drive, see wildlife, go on short hikes type of thing. Those that come to backpack in wilderness areas are a very, very small percentage of those folks that come here. And by their very nature, they don't spend a lot of money here because they're self-contained and all of that. So that's kind of interesting. And this last year's fire season cost the state economy, based on their calculations, just from a tourism perspective, about $250 million. Because it was smoky, people came, they went elsewhere, they did other things. Timber forest management for Montana is about an $850 million annual business. It's different though, because tourism is primary. More than 50% of the tourists come to Montana in July, August, and September. It's very seasonal, whereas timber is a year-round activity. And its revenue, its salaries, and sales out of state combined to $850 million. Now, 15 years ago, it was a $1.3 billion business, but we've lost a lot of mills, and of course the biggest issue that mills have is wood supply. And this gets more critical every year because private lands are about 17% of the forest land base in Montana. And once the Forest Service started diminishing their timber sales, the industry switched to doing a lot of harvesting on private lands. And so a lot of thinnings, things like that. And that resource has been tapped pretty hard. So that that resource is going to decline more into a maintenance forestry now. So providing a lot less timber than first strike, doing the fuel hazard reduction work and all of that. And so if something doesn't change on national forest lands, which used to be supply 70% of the timber, and now in the last years has supplied barely 20% of the timber for the state, we're going to lose more mills. And so these all wilderness areas, wilderness study areas, roadless areas are areas of concern because the Forest Service, of course, is not harvesting any timber off of those. Every year when we lose acreage to fire, that timber resource is subtracted from the overall forest pool from which mills can extract timber. It's burned. You have a 6-month to 1-year window to salvage log, and after that the logs are worthless, and you're going to have to wait 60 to 90 years before you have merchantable trees, if you have merchantable trees on those burned areas. So to date, with last year, 1/3 of the 25 million acres of forest land in Montana has burned in the last 17 years. 1/3. Okay? So that means that that's 1/3 that's out of the sustainable yield calculation of what the landscape can grow. I mean, just like 1/3 of cropland being gone. So, of course, there are concerned folks in the timber industry that are concerned about every acre that gets taken out of potential production. The good side about wilderness areas are that usually a large portion of them are not what you would call primary tree growing sites. They're harsh sites, they don't grow trees well. Now, there are percentages of parts of them that do grow trees fairly well, but so, you know, that's why the industry typically doesn't have a big issue with wilderness areas unless it's in areas that are capable of growing trees at a fairly reasonable rate, an economically viable rate, etc. So, and you know, of this proposed area, it's a small percentage. If I had to do a seat of the pants guesstimate, it would be under 20% of that landscape is suitable for timber harvesting. So, you know, but the fire danger, fire issue, you know, these are some things to consider. That once it's wilderness, it's a let burn area, and so, you know, that nobody's going to fight fires until it starts to move out of that wilderness area. Though, taking into account the way modern fires are fought, I don't know if that would make a big difference because they don't actively jump on them unless they're real small spots. At least this last summer they didn't. So we'll see. Right now, the whole firefighting issue is highly controversial. Let's put it that way. So that's a long-winded answer to your sort of short question there. But any other questions?
Did you have a question back there? You raised.
Yeah, just want to say thanks to Peter for your analysis, and I just for the commissioners and for the other folks in the room here, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. One is that grazing is common in wilderness. It is grandfathered in, so whenever grazing is present, that's almost never an issue. And so grazing is, you know, those rights don't go away.
I will disagree with you.
Well, I can present the documentation
Yeah, sure,
right here.
sure.
So I can. That's easy to print out for the commissioners. I can, you know, print out the regs on that. In addition, you know, the burn. Well, two things. One is, as you said, Peter. I mean, this area is not a place that the Wood Products Association is concerned with. I know for a fact, having talked to Julia Altimus from the Montana Wood Products Association just recently, these are not areas that the timber industry in the state is concerned about. They want to make sure that logs are coming off of the suitable timber base.
Right.
And for those who don't know, I work with the Montana Wilderness Association, and we do everything we can to help them harvest in the suitable timber base. That's something that we actively support, and so there's really no conflict there. The burning in this area, should that ever take place, quite a bit of the sapphires has already burned. So a lot of that is not at risk for burning in the near future. And the Forest Service.
Are you saying that's okay that it burned?
What's that?
Are you saying that's okay that it burned?
No, my point is that the likelihood of a large fire in much of this area is very low because a lot of it has burned, and the Forest Service will protect property, and that's not ever an issue in a case like this. So if the fire is in a place, or if the conditions are such that they are afraid of it growing out of control, they're going to take action, whether it's in a wilderness or not. That's not an issue there. Fighting fire in wilderness, that's perfectly legal under the law. So
It's just not usually done.
well, it is done when there's property, or other reasons, health, life, on the line. That's never an issue. So.
Well, I just don't understand, we're all in here on comment, I'm not just, like this year, I was on a fire, and we couldn't do nothing on the Forest Service ground, but yet they went into this whole, I don't know how many generation person's yard, had tamaracks, nice trees like this, and it was okay to shove them all over, but yet they would not do it on Forest Service ground.
There is,
I was really, and the guy begged them not to do it. He said, I'll sign, do whatever, and they just laughed
That
at
is
him.
unrelated to the wilderness study areas, though.
Huh?
I would say that that's unrelated to the wilderness study area discussion, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but I'm just saying he was talking about the fires.
Fires in the wilderness.
So,
So I guess I'm just asking, you said you don't have an opinion on it, but I mean, we're getting two different explanations for why this bill has come up. Some are saying it's because they want to be able to fight fires, and then others are saying they just want it released from designation so that then the Forest Service would have the ability to go through the regular public process. So I guess, do you not have an opinion on that, or?
well, what I'm trying to present, everything has multiple things to consider. So I'm just going through a list. When I got called and asked to look at this, I sat down and I generated a list of pros and cons. Okay, so if I were coming on out of the blue, which I am, I know the area just because I recreate in it, and forestry is an interest, so I don't ever go into an area and not notice the forest ecology that I'm dealing with there. But when you look at this area, as I make a list of the pros and the cons for turning it into a wilderness area. That's all I presented. Now, my personal opinions on it, I'd be glad to share if you want to know them. I'm an advocate of wilderness areas, but every landscape has to be looked at very carefully as where is it most suitable and where is it not most suitable. I haven't done that on the Sapphire, and it's not. It's something that the community at large should probably do, is look at, this makes sense, maybe all of it makes sense, this may not make sense. It's a process you follow. Right now, most proposed wilderness areas is sitting down on a map with a pencil, drawing a line around areas where there's no motorized access to, that looks relatively untouched by humans, and that's proposed as a wilderness area. That it has to start somewhere, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, except for there are plenty of wilderness areas where there's been a fair amount of human activity in there, not recently. So personally, I think a lot of this area would make perfect sense to be a wilderness area. But there are consequences for everything you do. There's consequences if you log it, there's consequences if you turn it into a wilderness area. You just have to, in a cognitive manner, go down the list and do the pros and the cons and say, okay, does this make sense? And Could very well be that the entire boundary as it's written right now makes sense. It could be it might require some modifications. Like I said, there's a four-wheeler track that goes all the way over to Valley County that cuts right down the middle of it. Have you talked to the RVers and the four-wheelers that use that track? How they feel about it? Because they've been using it for, as far as I know, for as long as four-wheelers have been around. So, you know, there's other users of this area. That's all.
I guess I'm just confused because they're trying to release it from the study area designation. They're not. So if they did that, it wouldn't automatically go to wilderness. It'd be up to the Forest Service again. So I guess that's where I'm just confused.
Well, I have no inside knowledge about why they're making that decision.
Okay.
I mean, I have heard that some areas have been study areas for 2 decades, and so that would raise the question, how long do you need to study this before you decide one way or the other?
And I don't know if this is pertinent or not, but John Tester had the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act, and which I believe the commissioners supported it, right? Yeah. So, and that included part of the sapphires, am I right?
I don't know the details, but yeah.
So that went through extensive public review and had support from the mining industry, the timber industry, the livestock industry. So I'm just wondering why it's just being rehashed.
Well, there are a lot of people that didn't support that bill.
Right, but there will be a lot of people that don't support this.
Yeah.
I mean, I just pointing out that this has had a lot of debate already, but I don't think the boundaries were quite like this. Do you? Is it the 90,000 for the?
Right, so the boundaries for the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act, just like the boundaries in 1988, I believe 1994 and 1996 were other proposals. So Congress has acted multiple times here. They were not necessarily directly aligned here. There were areas that were open for other uses, snowmobiling, and some portion of it was protected as wilderness. So there's always been a discussion about what the final boundaries would be.
Could you identify yourself, please? What's your name?
Oh,
That was Zach.
The guy that just spoke.
Zach Porter.
I'm Zach Porter.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sorry, Mike. Okay, Bill, Antonelli?
Yeah, great map.
Well, it's not mine. You can download this. It's on the,
Yeah, where
Great
it's
map.
on the internet.
I went twice to the Forest Service down here, and I thought, you know, they will probably know.
Kim Pellet, she's massive.
They will probably know, and both times they said, you know, can't help you with a map.
I just Googled it. It's pretty easy to find. I just downloaded these this morning.
Oh, can
You know,
see
those
them?
are on the internet.
Can you pass them around?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, great map. There's more than just one road in there, and it started out as a road, you know, it was put in with a D7. And it was to fight the sleeping child fire in the 60s, and then trappers from our county used that for making a living in the winter for the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. As far as I know, you said maybe it's been studied for 2 decades. I think it's been studied since 1977. And I had heard a rumor
Pass this around. That goes with the map.
that, well, it's not a rumor that they were supposed to decide within 5 years. The Forest Service was supposed to decide whether they would recommend it for wilderness or recommend it for multiple use. And I had heard a rumor that the recommendation for the Sapphire study area was that it not be wilderness. And I'm just wondering if anybody knows whether that's true or not. I don't know that.
I've been there.
Yeah.
We've never gotten nothing back from them.
Yeah.
Believe that?
Yeah, I do know the answer. So on the Beaverhead Deer Lodge side, they manage about 2/3 of the area currently as non-motorized and 1/3 as motorized. It is, I believe, not recommended in the current forest plan. On the Bitterroot side, the plan hasn't been updated since 1986. And so I think that it's actually very likely that a good portion of the Bitterroot side would be recommended. It's currently managed as both non-motorized and non-mechanized, both on the Bitterroot side. So it's honestly a bit of a mishmash of management from one side of it to the other.
All right.
Any other comments?
I would suspect that there's a lot more motorized use than might be designated. I'm always amazed when I go into these areas to hunt or backpack or recreate, how much motorized use I find in places where it's not designated. So just beware that, there probably are people using vehicles where they're not supposed to be. Not that they would know one way or the other about it, but
I don't think a lot of people look at the map, they've hunted there and they've gone in there for years and pretty much got their own little secret trail they go in and,
Right.
it is what it is on that part of it. Any other comments? On that note, like I said, we're gonna have to put it in the paper so we can see so we get it out to more people that might wanna be on this committee. I really appreciate you coming here in a short notice. I didn't give you a head, I just said I need you to come give a little speech and, other than that, I don't have, pardon me?
We were just trying to figure out where we could get the same maps, so we're just writing down the
We
names.
didn't try to get copies in there.
if you Google Montana Sapphire Wilderness area, in that first 5 hits, you'll have this
Yeah,
stuff.
it's the forest land management.
Well, one is a Bitterroot. The other map, there's a couple of maps out there, some of which are easier to download than others. It's pretty easy to find.
I'm gonna ask for a motion to form a committee, and then once we get this out and advertised, and that way we can pick it, and that's pretty much.
I would move to advertise it and get some more names, pick a committee, and move ahead with this
It's not my map.
process.
I second, any comments?
For free, I hope.
Someone not guy. I was
Did
gonna
you
ask
get
the
a copy of
commissioners,
that one?
would
Yeah,
there be any
great.
interest in inviting Ravalli County to participate as well, since, I believe about a third of it anyways is in Ravalli County, so that residents there could also participate in either the same process or a similar
Aren't they
process?
doing their own thing?
I don't believe anything similar is
The
currently
way I
going
understood in this email we got, that they're gonna bite us down, did you see that? Or, their email, whatever? Anyway, they were talking about, I'm glad we never heard about it. They want us to come down and their
She's gonna copy this for me.
Oh, I was gonna tell Scott to do them. Make a whole bunch for
Are you
all of
gonna
us.
snap your fingers?
I'm not aware
Oh,
of
no,
it.
I was gonna say, excuse me.
got it here.
I'll snap my fingers.
Anyway,
She
on
said
that note, I second it.
Oh, no, we're just having fun with Scott.
I just wonder, since there is some division, if you had like an odd number, then you might have 3 from one side and 2 from the other. Would it be better to have like 6 or 8?
I'm just not gonna get into a whole big bunch of it.
Right, okay, then 4 or 6.
We'll see.
I mean, I don't know, what do you
I
think,
want
Blaine,
this.
even or odd?
So, I guess, the thought comes to mind that if you have a chair, then usually it's odd. But I hear your
Right.
point on the
And Scott,
evenness
would
of
you-
it. So,
Sure.
either way, I would, if we're gonna form it today, I would probably discuss how many you want on there. Because then you can make a call for people to put in letters of.
And Scott, what's the purpose of this committee? Is it to advise the county commissioners whether or not to support Daines' bill?
Well, then that, we'll go, yeah, and then on the having a committee, just to get it more, what was it saying?
Gather information or?
Yeah,
What about total forest management? Can we go off into this other area?
what What's that?
Just that area, I think is what.
It's just this one area.
Do you have a forest collaborative group here in Granite County? No. Okay. I just bring that up because there's a lot of collaboratives that have formed. They don't have any real power other than it's stakeholders on land management, usually federal land management, one way or the other. And they've been really instrumental in a lot of places in helping delineate areas that are best suited for wilderness and best suited for multiple use based on local knowledge and local uses. I think there's about, 15 of them in Montana now, a lot of them across the West. And they've proven to be very useful in helping to provide local citizen and interest group, as the term says, collaborative work on things, you know, so that groups aren't excluded and that there's more of a grassroots, broad-based local consensus of, yes, this makes sense and that doesn't make sense, etc. That's a whole different process to form one, but
And that's kind of what we're gonna be looking at with our committee.
And that's what
Wait, what?
Custer Gallatin Working Group has one.
yeah.
That's right.
That's, I started reading it and I did not get through it all.
I believe there's a Deer Lodge collaborative that's working over there.
Here too.
Okay.
So can I ask you a question about this map that you got off the internet? I see there down in the bottom quarter, there's kind of a thing that goes in so that the county road number 80 is not in the wilderness study area over on the east side there. Okay? And then there's some white there, which I'm presuming is like the Montana Prince, private property. And that private property would appear to me to be in the wilderness study area.
Right here.
Bingo. And I wonder how wise that is. You know, I mean, but, I mean, is that the way you read the map?
Yes.
So interesting is all I'm saying. You know, if I was a private property owner there, I might not be very interested in being in a wilderness area. It happens, and it just restricts the hell out of what you can do on your property. You know, so just an interesting point about the map, and she's gonna copy that map for me. I kind of like that map.
According to the map, I believe it's excluded outside of it's an inholding in the proposed wilderness area.
Yeah, and to Bill's point, I mean, I think some people like having their land in the middle of a wilderness. I mean, I've heard of that too, and I think even in national parks, there are private inholdings.
Of course. There's a guy right here in town that owns property in Yosemite National Park. But there is a guy from Missoula, his name is Weaver, and he owns a mining claim in the Anaconda Pintler, and he's not too happy. He can't even snowmobile up to his place 2 or 3 times a year to bring in supplies. So he is extremely unhappy about being in the wilderness. Just, you know, there's a lot of stuff to consider.
Well, I think we got, like I said, we'll get this out and get some more people on this board and we'll go from there. We have another pass of time.
So you may want to clarify the motion on the number on the board, and so you may want to add that to your motion.
What, you had mentioned 5 to 7. Did you want an even number? Or along with yourself?
Let's just split it, go 6.
Okay.
Because Scott will be the chairman.
I will alter that motion to include six people on the board, and with Scott being the chairperson, and you know, I moved.
I'll second it.
I think
Any
there
other
was some.
comments?
Yeah, I think that template that you had gotten with Custer Gallatin Working Group, I think that's excellent. The way it's set up and the people that should be on the committee, that would give a good cross-section of who would be on it. So I think you should look at that before you,
Like I said, I only got through a couple pages.
Yeah.
I apologize.
working group, is this just about the Sapphire Wilderness Study Area, or is it to evolve into a collaborative group?
I think it's gonna evolve into, I'd like to see it go into a group, cause being that after, I learned quite a bit last meeting when they said that the commissioners can go, you know, have a little more authority in saying what, you know, with stuff, so I'd just assume it's not just gonna be stuck once this is, the bill goes or don't, that it's go. I'd like to have, you know, something that, a collaborative group that we can all keep. I think we need to wake up and see really what's going on both sides.
So should the name not be changed then from the Wilderness
Yeah, probably should
Study
be.
Area Committee?
Might wanna, yeah,
Well,
revise the name and the.
Just so that if people are gonna apply, they know what they're in for, they're
That's
not,
a good point.
Instead of having, yeah.
they're not thinking, well, we're gonna deal with this, and then they're tied into,
I think we should have it up to the commissioners and that. I think a collaborative group would be great.
Now, for a collaborative group, it's treated almost as a 501c3, so you have to have articles of incorporation and things like that with it. So I'd suggest,
And I think there's some grant monies involved that can be found.
yeah, I would look at the Deer Lodge Collaborative Working Group as an example, because there's a process you go through to establish yourselves.
Okay.
So you may wanna, have it on the agenda again, a different time, but get them next week to,
Deal with this and
so you may wanna just
Yeah.
withdraw your motion.
expand it.
Yeah, to that point, because like Maureen Connor and Chris Marchion, they're in that Beaverhead group, and they say that's very good. And, you know, there's ranchers and ATV people and foresters, and I think our county could really use that, but I think it's well beyond the scope of why our little group is here, if that makes sense.
So I think you could continue on with just the wilderness study group, and then later on do the collaborative.
And then,
So,
that's what I would suggest.
That way at least we can get going, otherwise
going
if
on
we
this.
keep waiting, and then if we're gonna go with that, we can always get a collaborative group going.
okay, so then your motion's fine.
Any other comments? Chuck?
I
Aye. Motion been carried and passed, and I thank everybody, I thank you, Peter, for coming, and
thank you, Peter. for-
Thank you.
Hey, thanks.
thank you, Peter.
Appreciate that.
there's forms there if you want to fill them out.
Yeah.